Thank you for joining us and Happy New Year. I'm Jamie Gass, Director of Pioneer Education. Welcome to the webinar on our new booklet, Restoring the Republic, a Blueprint for Constitutional Administration. Here's a copy of it. In Federalist number 51, James Madison wrote, "What is government itself but the greatest of all reflections on human nature? If men were angels, no government would be necessary. In framing a government which is to be administered by men over men, the great difficulty lies in this. You must first enable the government to control the governed, and in the next, oblige it to control itself." The framers knew that their experiment in ordered liberty rested on a citizenry who was well educated in the basics of civics, grounded in the ideals of union, the separation of powers, federalism, and respect for the rule of law. But they also established constitutions based on limited government to require publicly elected and appointed officials to understand and properly uphold the fundamentals of constitutionalism, not to mention the public trust itself. As products of the Enlightenment, the framers' commitment to government based on reason, consent, and constitutionalism was guided by a working knowledge of the past, especially the lessons drawn from ancient Greek, Roman, and British history. Every day, many heroic public officials and teachers alike keep their sworn promise to the people they represent by ennobling public service while keeping the public trust and civic duty alive, body and soul, in our halls of justice and classrooms. But needless to say, in contrast to the advice of our framers, civic education for constitutionalism has not been the central focus of K-12 education for the last at least 40 years. Today, we're living in an era with too many elected officials, themselves the products of these decades of civic educational neglect, who seem oblivious about putting their obligations to country and the common good ahead of narrow self-interest and mere partisanship. Consequently, as was true with ancient Rome and the British Empire before us, our own gargantuan federal bureaucracies too often seem accountable to the Congress, presidents, the courts, or the people. In turn, the state governments, or as Justice Louis Brandeis called them, laboratories of democracy, are often micromanaged by regulatory carrots and sticks from the Beltway. As a result, governors and state legislators are not fully permitted to experiment, innovate, or offer meaningful improvements as they once did successfully with K-12 education and welfare reform in the 1990s. Make no mistake, when every policy matter becomes nationalized, it drains the energy and liberty from the federal system our framers worked so hard to establish. Now, like Washington Irving's Rip Van Winkle, who slumbered for decades, we awaken to find ourselves in an entirely different country. We can see the overt disregard for the founding documents in our classrooms and in higher education, the brushing aside of basic constitutional principles among our politicians, and repeated violations of the public trust. This has opened the door for demagogic elected officials of both parties to normalize maladministration and blatant abuses of power while plundering the public treasury. Ultimately, this then causes citizens to further disconnect from public matters and return to slumber, cynicism, or worse. History tells us this is a very old story. Whether from our elected officials or misguided citizens across the spectrum, the daily news reflects what we can only regard as our grave crisis in self-government. If our country is going to remain, as Lincoln said, the last best hope of Earth, we must change this with reason and fact-based research, as well as sound law-giving and policymaking that's worthy of a free people. We at Pioneer are proud of our long-standing efforts in support of teaching U.S. history and civics in our schools, which is central to our mission. We're also equally and deeply committed to ensuring that our public officials govern with fidelity to American constitutionalism, provide reform-oriented leadership, and are accountable to the people they're intended to serve. This is why we're so honored and pleased to publish Restoring the Republic, a blueprint for constitutional administration. This booklet was the product of over a year and a half of thoughtful, deliberative discussions among dozens of academic experts, attorneys, and former state and federal officials. Our goal is to propose rational and concrete reforms across the federal legislature, executive, and the agencies, which are nonpartisan and aligned with basic constitutionalism and good government. Without such a list, there is no path to rein in the administrative state. By working to bring the federal government into conformity with American constitutional practices and principles, there is potential to restore our federal system to its full vigor. This would then allow state and locally driven ingenuity to flourish because, as Alexis de Tocqueville noted in Democracy in America, quote, local assemblies of citizens constitute the strength of free nations. Town meetings are to liberty what primary schools are to science. They bring it within the people's reach. They teach men how to use and how to enjoy it. A nation may establish a system of free government, but without the spirit of municipal institutions, it cannot have the spirit of liberty, end quote. With us this afternoon, we have Adam Millsap, a senior fellow at Stand Together Trust, focusing on economic issues. Charles Keckler is the director of Northeastern University's Doctor of Law and Policy program and a professor of the practice. Emmett McGroarty is executive director of Belmont House at Belmont Abbey College and a faculty fellow at its Honors College. Adam White is a senior fellow and the Lawrence H. Silberman Chair at the American Enterprise Institute, and he is executive director of the Antonin Scalia Law School's C. Boyden Gray Center for the study of the administrative state. We're pleased to begin with Adam Millsap.
Thank you, Jamie. So I'm just going to do a quick overview of the booklet before we jump into the panel. So as Jamie mentioned, we've been working on this thing for over a year with a broad working group of several different scholars and policy researchers who think about how the government should function. And one thing that we all noticed was that today's government, federal government, is not functioning the way the founding fathers intended and in accordance with the Constitution. So we collected a bunch of reforms that had been floating around in the ecosystem out there for several years, and we wanted to collect them. We came up with some new ones. We wanted to put them all in one place and organize them so that a reform-minded administration and a reform-minded Congress could have a playbook and some ideas, some real tangible ideas that they could take and act on in order to bring government practice in alignment with the constitutional structure. So the way we organized the book is in 4 sections, and this is just executive and legislative action. So there's nothing to do with litigation in here. This is not about, suing to overturn Chevron deference, which happened in this last Supreme Court cycle, or anything like that. This is steps that the executive branch can take either through executive orders and that Congress can take through legislation in order to better align the way the government functions with the Constitution. So the first set of reforms is increasing presidential authority. And that might sound weird because often we talk about how the executive branch has become too powerful and has taken some power away from Congress. And we'll get to that bucket of reforms in a minute. But there's also ways in which the president is actually not as powerful as he should be when it comes to managing the executive branch. So one example of that would be to bring independent agencies under the authority of OIRA, the Office of Information and Regulatory Affairs, when it comes to rulemaking. So right now, there's several agencies, the FTC and National Labor Relations Board, that don't have to submit their rules to OIRA. So one reform would be to bring them under OIRA so that the president has more oversight in what these agencies are doing. Another reform would be federal workforce reform. So give the president more control over the workforce to get rid of people who aren't doing their job well or misconduct. And so it can have better control over the employees that are helping to execute their president's executive agenda. Then the second bucket of reforms goes back to this idea of Congress has delegated too much authority to the executive branch. So the idea of horizontal federalism. So this list of reforms, things like the REINS Act, which would give Congress more oversight of rules, things like a regulatory budget, which would constrain the amount of rules and the costs that administrative agencies can impose on the economy and on citizens through their rulemaking. These would give Congress more authority over the laws that citizens are held to account. The third bucket of reforms is about strengthening vertical federalism, so the relationship between the federal government and state governments. So right now, and Adam White mentions this in his foreword to the booklet, in many ways, states have just become administrative units for federal programs. So the federal government comes up with all the programs, they do the experimentation, they push some money down to the states, they tell the states how to run the programs, and then the states just execute. And that's not what the founders intended. The states are sovereign. They're supposed to be the laboratories of democracy, the laboratories of policy, and that's not what we see right now. So the third set of reforms are things that the executive branch can do and that Congress can do to give states more independence and allow them to execute their duties under the Constitution. And then finally, the last bucket of reforms is about protecting against threats to individual liberty. So this involves how we can constrain the administrative state and the impact that directly has on citizens. So one of the reforms there that we might discuss later on in the panel is something like having show cause hearings for administrative adjudications. So allowing people who are accused of violating some kind of administrative rule to come and present their case and make the government show that there's credible evidence that they've actually violated it. And so those are the four buckets. Increasing presidential authority over the things the president should have authority over, how the executive branch functions. Restoring federalism at the federal level, so making sure that Congress is doing its job and the executive branch, the president, is doing its job, and that Congress is not delegating too much authority to the president. Then the vertical federalism, protecting the relationship between the federal government and the states. And then finally, protecting against direct threats to individual liberty that administrative agencies might be imposing on the citizens. So with that, I'm going to kick it back over to Adam White to introduce the panel.
Great, thanks, Adam. And I just want to say it's a real pleasure to be here. When the Pioneer Institute reached out to me about being a part of this project and ultimately writing the forward to it, I was really honored to be part of it. First of all, I just appreciate all the good work that the Pioneer Institute does. But second, as was discussed in the introductions to this project has been a long time in the making, a lot of conversations, a lot of deliberation. And so from the start, it was clear this was going to be a really serious and thoughtful project. And the proof is in the pudding. I'd really encourage everybody, don't just rest on Adam Millsap's thorough overview of the project and the conversation we're about to have. But if you're tuning in now, or if you're watching this after the fact, please do get a copy of the report on Amazon or elsewhere. To really take a look at the proposals and the explanations in here. I think you'll benefit a lot from it, and hopefully decision makers will as well. One thing I want to point out, it's been alluded to already, but a recurring theme throughout this conversation, throughout the report, is that this is not just a question about federal power. The book ends very thoughtfully with conversations with deliberations on individual liberty. And then in the middle of all of that is the states. The importance, I think, of the state's own role in good government and in protecting individual liberty, right? The states, not just as laboratories for democracy, but also for laboratories of liberty, really can't be understated or really shouldn't be understated or underappreciated. I think the report does real justice to that. And it's important at the federal level to look at not just how federal government can become more productive or more efficient, but also how it can be properly made to create space for state level experimentation and often state level resolution. So I did appreciate that part of the report, and really it is characteristic of the Pioneer Institute's broader mission and work. Maybe I'll bring back on the authors of this report. And again, I was so glad to be part of this because I knew these guys would be doing great work. Emmett McGroarty, Charles Keckler, and Adam Millsap. If they wouldn't mind turning their cameras back on, we'll have a conversation here. As they are bringing their cameras back on, I can see it. Oh, here we are. It is striking that the report begins with a chapter on strengthening presidential authority. As Adam alluded to a moment ago, we've seen in recent years the Supreme Court and other courts in many ways trying to constrain presidential authority. But when I talk with students about this, I'm always trying to focus them on what kind of power is it that the court is constraining in one way or another, or in other cases, when the court has sort of maybe not deferred, but made space for presidential authority. It's important to focus on what exactly it is the president's doing in that case that the court is trying to leave space for. Maybe I'll just turn it back over to Adam for the first thought on this. But Adam, why does the report begin with strengthening presidential authority? Why is that the place to start?
I think your point you just made is really good, actually, because a lot of times people are saying that the president has too much power, and like I said, in some ways that's true, but they also don't have enough power over the things they should. So starting off with saying like this is what it's not that the executive branch can't have, in the words I think you're talking the introduction, have energy in the executive, right? They can. It's just that has to be constrained by what the founding fathers intended, right? So that's in executing the laws as passed by Congress, not coming up with its own. And so the reforms we have in here would give the president more power back over the executive branch, making sure it has oversight over the agencies that are part of the executive branch created by Congress, but then given to the executive branch to control. Same with the federal workforce. And so same with, the regulatory budget, putting a moratorium on regulations so that they can understand exactly what the agencies are doing. So these kind of reforms would allow the president to do things, but do the things that the founding fathers intended rather than encroaching itself into lawmaking, which is Congress's job.
Energy in the executive, not so much energy in the legislature, at least not as much. Charles, I'd love your opening thoughts on presidential power, but I want to ask specifically about OIRA and independent agencies. When in the introductions, it was mentioned I helped run a program called the Boyden Gray Center for the Study of the Administrative State. Boyden was present for the creation. He helped President Reagan and Vice President Bush and the others create OIRA in the first place back in '81. And when at the time when they created it, then as now, it was really focused on the core executive branch agencies. They left the so-called independent agencies off to the side. And when Boyden was asked about this back in '81 at a public event on OIRA, somebody asked, why did you not rope in the independent agencies? And he said, well, we're already doing a lot as it is. The president has constitutional power to oversee and be in charge of the independent agencies. But in this case with OIRA, we just figured we'll start with the executive agencies because they're the most important ones. The independent agencies, they really don't do so much. The past truly is a foreign country, I guess, because now oftentimes it's the independent agencies like the SEC or FERC or the NLRB that are doing so much. So Charles, big picture thoughts on how we should think about executive power in a project like this, and more specifically, how should we think about the White House's connection and oversight of connection to and oversight of the so-called independent commissions?
Yeah, well, let's start as we try to do in the report by beginning with the Constitution, right? So, apart from the various sort of debates over whether all executive powers inherent in the president, and all of those sort of debates about the unitary executive, the president very clearly has the responsibility and therefore the power, and by inference, to take care that the law be faithfully executed. Okay, so that's where it begins. Well, how do we execute the laws? Well, regulations properly done, in particular, are executions of the laws that Congress passes. They should not be new laws. They're implementations and therefore executions of the laws. So how is the president going to fulfill his take care responsibilities unless he has some level of oversight over the most essential parts of those regulations? I mean, I consider myself, did my dissertation on the independent commissions. It's sort of my area. I've worked in an independent agency and led it. I think there's a role for them in our administrative state, but the president is still the top person within that. They are part of the executive branch. They're not a separate branch. They're clearly part of the executive branch, and therefore they're clearly under the oversight and under the responsibility of the president to take care the laws are faithfully executed, the laws that they execute, the laws that the SEC is given to execute by Congress, that the FTC, and so on. And I think you're right, they become more important, but probably partly because they've had less supervision, they've been able to do a lot more and assume this larger and larger role in American life and over American commerce. And I think the minimum thing with OIRA, the Office of Information and Regulatory Affairs, which oversees it's a kind of a quality control mechanism for any kind of regulations that are produced within the executive branch. And that's another way of saying that they're making sure that those laws are faithfully executed. They're done according to, they make the regulations that they're needed, that they're in compliance with the law, that they conform to issues of cost benefit analysis, that they're beneficial to the American public, and that they're promulgated in the correct way. And I think that that important function that OIRA has served for the executive branch as a whole, I think it has been one of the success stories of reform. Partly for its sort of long record of success and its high quality of staff. It has a relatively small staff, like 50 people to oversee all of this. And it's a mechanism for, yes, implementing the president's agenda and regulatory and deregulatory agenda, but also for the American people to make sure that these regulations are done in the right way and so that they're of benefit. And I think that at minimum, I think independent agencies, my personal view, can continue to develop their policies according to, their thinking and their expertise. But the way they do them needs to be overseen by OIRA. And that also allows the president to, I think, fulfill his constitutional duty over them.
Charles, can I just ask a quick follow-up question on this?
Sure.
When I was listing independent commissions before, in my head I was struggling. I knew there was one important one I was forgetting, and obviously the Federal Trade Commission.
Yes.
Sort of the great granddaddy of them all in many ways. All the way back to Humphrey's Executor, and before that, had been a very sleepy agency for most of its history. Not so much in the 1970s, and definitely not so much in the last 4 years. Surely that the FTC's rise to prominence in the last few years probably has fueled calls to restore presidential oversight over these agencies. I have to say, I guess here's my question is, the constitutional arguments around White House oversight of independent commissions, that's been litigated, rhetorically for the last 40 years. I don't think there's real serious arguments anymore that the president can't assert OIRA oversight over independent commissions. There's like somewhat more nuanced arguments about particular subject matters, right? Should the president be deeply involved in financial regulation? I mean, you could see prudentially why the more you get to sort of closer direct intervention into markets, into financial markets, there's maybe more difficult questions raised prudentially, not constitutionally. But then you just get into the practical aspect of this. And so here's what I'm asking is, it's one thing for the president to have OIRA overseeing the EPA, where there's one person at the top, or the IRS, which we'll get to in a moment. Most member commissions are tricky because they're multi-member, right? You have 5 members usually, probably 3 of the president's party, 2 of the other party. Given that you've spent a lot of time over the years studying independent commissions, do you have any practical suggestions for how OIRA oversight might work with multi-member commissions? Maybe the simple answer is just it'll be straightforward. The chairman of a commission can really run this process. But do you have any further thoughts on that, how this will work?
Yeah, so I think that OIRA, certainly they're looking at the work product of the commission, and they're looking at it according to a set of principles. So the question will be, they can enforce cost benefit principles. They can enforce the rules of the Administrative Procedure Act that this was done correctly. Now, the issue that you're raising has to do with if the president doesn't agree with the policy of the commission. And I think that there's some structural reforms probably that need to occur over time. And I've actually written about this a little bit, in which it would be much better and much simpler if the majority on commissions tracked the president's party. And I call this a reverse parliamentary model, in which, the mini legislature that is a commission follows the election of the president. And many of them do that informally, in which the chairman will offer his or her resignation upon the inauguration of a new president. But I think that that's an area that would make it simpler, because at the core of this idea is, yes, they do have some policy independence, but there is a political accountability by the sort of presidential influence on appointments. And also, there are people, as I was for 7 years, I was a minority member on the board there. So I was appointed by President Obama. I didn't agree with President Obama, everybody, but President Obama, in effect, sort of permitted, in that independent agencies, the Legal Services Corporation, as well as others, that there would be another team. There would be dissenters and a minority party view that was represented. I think that's an important value that can be maintained and be consistent if we can just make some minor reforms to align the majority with the president.
Thanks, Charles. Emmett, let me bring you into the conversation now. What we just discussed, the Oira and independent commissions, I got to be honest, I'd be surprised if the Trump administration didn't finally move forward with an executive order along those lines. It didn't in the first Trump term. One thing that what the President Trump did the first time around was to extend Oira oversight to the IRS's regulations. The IRS is not a multi-member independent commission, right? It's had various forms of independence of a sort, but it's there in the Treasury Department. And for a very long time, all the way back to the Reagan administration, the IRS had basically been carved out of Oira oversight. President Trump's first Oira administrator, Naomi Rao, and the GC of the Treasury Department, Brent McIntosh, in the last Trump administration, they executed a memorandum of understanding to bring IRS regulations somewhat into the Oira umbrella. This report returns to that theme. Could you give us your thoughts on Oira oversight of IRS regulations?
Yeah, Adam, you know what, the IRS is like the independent agencies. They've been given a bit of a pass previously. And I guess that the thinking there was, well, the IRS is just collecting money. It's not really driving policy. However, we've seen a metamorphosis over the last couple of decades, and increasingly the IRS is being used to drive policy or nudge citizen behavior. So it really is getting into regulatory behavior, and it needs to be brought under the full Oira OMB review, sort of as the internal check and balance to make sure the law is being followed and the agencies are staying within their authorizations. And I think that this problem might continue to get worse. You know, we're seeing increasingly in this information age, we're seeing legislators of both parties, I might add, kind of start looking at the IRS and realizing that agency collects a lot of information on citizens and citizen behavior. And why don't we just start tapping into that information? There's been a bill popping up in Congress over the last couple of years to tap into IRS information to start rating colleges, for example, on the return of investment that the students get. So these are both tremendous shifts that are going on with how the IRS operates, and we really need to have full political accountability if we want to protect liberty.
That's a great point. Well, thank you. I want to point out, I think it's been alluded to, but if not, one of the things I really like about the report is that in these first two chapters, especially the one focused on strengthening the executive power, properly understood, and then really restoring the legislative power through restoring the separation of powers. The report focuses on what can be done through executive action, and then what can be done through legislation. It's very, very careful in how it parcels these things out to show that both in recalibrating the presidency and recalibrating the legislature and separation of powers, that it's going to require reforms both within Congress and within the presidency itself. One of in the executive branch focus chapter 1, the legislative agenda focuses on repealing privateering laws, private rights of action, where individuals are authorized to bring lawsuits to basically enforce federal law and policy, even where the individual bringing the lawsuit has a pretty dubious claim to having been injured by anything, right? These are really bounty hunter laws. They operate at the federal level and at the state level. I was really glad to see this in the report. I've been involved for a while, if I can plug this, in a C3 and a C4, the Center for Constitutional Responsibility and Citizens for Legal Reform, really raising this issue. It does sort of, these statutes effectively delegate executive power away from the executive branch into the hands of litigators. As a former litigator myself, I guess, I can appreciate it in some ways, but it's really no way to run a country. It really is a corroding of the executive power and of responsibility for the execution of laws. So I was really glad to see this in the report. Another thing that's in the report, looking back at the executive actions portion of the executive power section, is focused on federal workforce principles. This might be the most controversial issue around executive power in the last 4 years. At the end of the first Trump term, 4 years ago, President Trump signed an executive order on what was called Schedule F, an effort to recalibrate the civil service laws around this particular class of federal employees who are not politically appointed. They're civil servants, but they have policymaking discretion. That's in this report. Adam, Millsap, would you maybe say a word about this, about the workforce principles?
Yeah, sure. Excuse me. I think the thing that we're trying to get across in this report is just this idea of more oversight over the workforce, right? And to your point, there have been a lot of debates around how far down, the hierarchy, the org chart should be appointed versus civil servant. I know there's a lot of heated discussion sometimes about that. But I think some of the stuff that Trump did and some of the stuff that's mentioned in this report are just kind of like common sense measures about the way to do collective bargaining agreements, right? Trying to keep the bargaining time to 1 year or less, making sure that the people who are bargaining on the government side are doing it in the taxpayers' interest rather than in the workers' interest. So holding the agreements to the highest levels of integrity and competence, and making sure that the workforce delivers and has a customer-centric focus when they're doing their job. I think sometimes it's not always clear that the people doing the bargaining on the government side are they bargaining on behalf of the taxpayers or just bargaining with the workers, right? And so I think he was just trying to put in some guidelines there that made it clear whose side they were on. There's the other one about union time. So right now, if you're a part of the union, you get a lot of time to go do union activities. And so one of the reforms in there was making sure that people who were union representatives spent the bulk of their time actually working for the taxpayer who was paying their salary rather than working for their union. So I think these are just the common sense measures that would get a little more accountability to the federal workforce, so that to make sure they're, like I said, delivering for the constituents and the taxpayers. One of the things I heard recently from Steve Tellis, actually at another panel, he was talking about it'll be interesting to see which party becomes the party of customer service. I think that's one of the things that both major political parties have lost when it comes to running the government. Neither one of them thinks about how can we make the government more efficient so it delivers for the taxpayers and their constituents. Instead, they have all these other stakeholders that they think about, the government workforce and their own political party and all this kind of stuff. No one's thinking about, can we just deliver services in a competent way? And Steve's point was, I think the party that really leans into that at some point might really get a leg up when it comes to winning elections if they show that they can actually deliver for taxpayers. And so I think these workforce principles are one way to get us there, and at least help them.
Now, we've only really skimmed the surface of the executive power section. We're not going to have time to do justice to any of the chapters really in full in this conversation. But before we move on, Charles, Emmett, any further thoughts on the executive power section?
I'll just add one point on it, Adam, which is, part of this, and this is part of the overall structure of the report. It does require that the people within the executive branch have this overall sense of the Constitution. So on the one hand, yes, strengthen presidential authority over the executive branch, but also understand that the executive branch is there to execute the laws. don't, they're going to, at some point, somebody, and I think particularly within the executive branch, is going to have to take proactive, concrete steps to give back their power to Congress and to do that. And so we talk in there about putting limits on regulations, limiting regulations so that they don't exceed statutory authority, and trying to leave these questions very explicitly to Congress to act rather than try. In many ways, it's very tempting. I've been a regulator. It's very tempting to say, oh, Congress wrote this vague law. Congress won't act. We need to act. We need to do it. We need to do the regulations. But you've got to build in structures and principles to resist that and to be willing, even if you think that that's the best thing in the immediate thing, and you, for very good reasons, to try to limit your own power and restrict yourself to executing rather than legislating.
That's a great point. Emmett, any closing thoughts on executive power?
Well, yeah, I think all of the sections of the book are really furthering a particular principle, and that's that anyone exercising power in government has to be accountable, ultimately accountable to the people, and that is something we've missed over the last 40 or 50 years, so we've lapsed in protecting that. In the 1950s and even in the late 1960s, the American citizens had a very high level of confidence in their government. And as government has expanded, that level of confidence in poll after poll after poll, study after study, has steadily decreased to now it's down in the teens. So we're really at a crisis point now in this, and we've got to restore the confidence people have in their government. In other words, we've got to return government to the people.
Yeah, and this is a safe place to always be plugging the Federalist, right? And in Hamilton's writings on administration, right, Federalist 67, 68 through 76, he returns time and time again that it's good administration that's actually going to build people's trust in government. Lethargic, ineffective administration is going to be the easiest way to corrode the public's trust in government. And I'd say, once again, the proof is in the pudding today. Let's turn our attention to Congress, Chapter 2. Once again, we see executive actions, which, to Charles's point earlier, really call on the president of the executive branch to help make Congress a better version of itself by, in many ways, constraining the executive branch itself. Then there's the second part on the legislative agenda is ways in which Congress can both reclaim its power through things like the REINS Act, but also Congress can make itself a better steward of its own power by reorganizing parts of itself, creating a congressional regulatory office, and so on. We could start with either the Congress-focused part of this or the executive. Maybe since we've spent so much time talking about the executive so far, let's look at Congress as Congress. Maybe on the REINS Act. Adam, I'll just start with you. I feel like the REINS Act has now been discussed forever. How should we think about the REINS Act at this moment in time?
Yeah, so the REINS Act, for people unfamiliar with it, it's just this idea that major rules would have to go to Congress for their approval, and we can define major rules differently. Oira used to define them as, economically significant, $100 million of impact. Biden changed that a little bit to $200 million, and also kind of changed the criteria a little bit, as I understand it. But that can be written into the REINS Act itself. And the idea is just give Congress more oversight over major rules that are coming down from the agencies. I think some states have done this. So Kansas recently implemented a state level REINS Act, and I think some other states are considering it. So we might get a better sense of how it would work by watching some of the states. This goes back to this idea of vertical federalism, right? Let the states be the laboratories of policy and democracy, so we can see how these things would work. And so now we have an example in Kansas, and we can see how that might filter up to the federal government if it proves to be effective, right? And so the idea is just to give the legislative branch more oversight over what Congress is, what the executive branch is doing. Another reform that builds into that, though, that we mentioned too, is a kind of a congressional Oira. So I think part of the reason the Congress has been so reluctant to write detailed laws is because they don't really have the expertise, right? They look to the executive branch and they see that all of the experts are in the agencies themselves, right? When you think about all the economists, all the PhDs are in the agencies. I'm sure it's the same thing for the national health organizations and things like that. All the doctors are in the Medicaid services and Medicare services and stuff like that. They're not in Congress. And so it's easy to defer to that expertise. So the idea would be to have a congressional version of that where some experts could live to help check what the executive branch is doing so that all of the expertise is not just on one side. And that could take several different forms. I mean, the Congressional Research Service, people point to that, but that's not really what the Congressional Research Service does. So this would be a way for Congress to have some of its own experts so that when it's making laws, even if it doesn't necessarily get to that level of specificity, it can at least check what the agencies are doing by having its own experts it can run things by, right? And so right now, Congress doesn't really have that.
Yeah, Charles, any further thoughts on the Congressional Regulatory Office? I know my colleagues at AEI, Phil Wallach and Kevin Kosar, have written about this over the years. And sometimes various proposals, they use the same term, Congressional Regulatory Office, but they mean it to do different things. What specifically would you propose for a Congressional Regulatory Office to do?
Well, what we need is something equivalent, as Adam's already discussed, that's similar to the Congressional Budget Office. We have budget. We have the Office of Management, Budget, and the Executive Branch, but we have a Congressional Budget Office because it's the source where spending happens. Well, that's all. It's also the source where any legal authority for regulation happens. It's ultimately that's where it's coming from the legislative branch, and understanding that internally and creating that institutional knowledge that's the equivalent of the CBO, and also that over time, as the CBO is developed institutionally within Congress, it is relied upon regularly, and you have to get a CBO score. What I think ultimately you're going to want to do over time, as people get used to using it, members, is a CRO score, is understanding both, I think, on the one hand, on the back end, when the executive branch sends possible rules or proposed rules over, there's somebody to receive them and analyze them and say, hey, is this really what we meant when we passed this statute? And it creates an institutional home for that analysis that comes from Congress itself. But I think also prospectively, the Congressional Regulatory Office can look at laws and say, look, what is this going to do? We're going to have regulatory experts there in Congress saying, as a regulator, they're going to drive a truck through this language. Is that what you really want, committee? That sort of, those experts should be available to our legislators, and they shouldn't be relying on the executive branch, which is not the same branch, and it's not involved in legislating, and it also has sort of a strange sort of conflict of interest almost in that, it's very hard, as it's sort of already referred to, for the executive branch to say, hey, I don't want that. Don't give me that power, right? But a Congressional Regulatory Office within Congress can say, hey, let's keep our authority within bounds here in Congress.
Yeah, so this is a way for Congress to really preserve its authority against encroachment by the executive branch. Of course, Emmett, in the other direction, we want to make sure that Congress stays within its proper limits, and there's a role for presidents both in vetoing legislation, but then sort of in ongoing deliberations between the president and Congress. One of the proposals in the book on the executive actions portion of the Congress chapter is titled "Guard Against Unauthorized Expansions of Government." How can the president and the executive branch guard against unauthorized expansions of the federal government?
Well, what we have of course, the executive branch is organized by departments or agencies, which are meant to implement specific laws to ensure that there's focus and to make sure that not any one agency gets too much power. But counter to that, what you have are these efforts in the agencies over the years to kind of combine forces and to take on joint efforts that really negate the silos that Congress erected. So what there has to be is a conscious effort to make sure that the agencies don't combine their authorities and their spending to exert more power in a broader fashion than Congress intended. And you can look at things as just a few examples over the years. You know, you had in 1988, starting in 1988, the Public Health Service, through grants and discussions, expanded the definition of public health, and thereby sort of kind of appropriated to themselves a broader mission than Congress ever intended. Also you've seen in the past few years a Partnership for Sustainable Community, which was HUD and EPA getting together and deciding, well, we're gonna start shaping how cities should look. We don't want single family homes. We want people living in multifamily homes. We don't want them driving their cars. We want them taking public transportation. This had a tremendous influence on our built environment. And so efforts like that need to be monitored and sort of managed by the executive branch, and maybe oftentimes just simply prohibited. This is becoming even more important. You know, we've seen over the last 4 years the federal executive branch sort of incorporate Tony Blair's idea of whole of government approach. That's well, some policies are so important that every agency should be engaged in doing everything it can to push those policies. So you saw that with the environmental, social, and governance idea, the ESG rules. So
I'm always struck, Emmett, whenever I hear the whole of government approach, whoever's saying it tends not to mean Congress and tends not to mean the states. I've always thought it's a revealing term that they really think of administration as itself as the whole of government. One question, just to throw out to the group, not anyone in particular, the executive action portion of the separation of powers chapter begins with the regulatory budget executive order. This again is something President Trump did in his first term, an executive order that put each agency on a budget, so to speak, limiting how much cost the agency could impose upon society. Again, I'd be shocked if the next Trump term didn't restore that executive order. How do regulatory budgets preserve the separation of powers? Throw that out to whoever wants to go with it.
Yeah, I'm happy to jump in. I think one way it does it is just by kind of constraining and making the agencies be more thoughtful about what they're doing. So if there's some kind of budget in place, they're going to really weigh the trade-offs between this regulation versus that regulation. So it doesn't necessarily give power back to Congress, but it at least constrains and forces trade-offs among the agencies' rules when they're thinking about what to push forward and what not to push forward. So it kind of like slows them down while maybe Congress can do some other things to catch up, as far as taking some of the power back from the executive branch. But and to your point, Trump did this the first time, and it was pretty successful. American Action Forum has a regulatory tracker that they do, and you can look at the cost of regulation across different administrations. And when you look at Trump's numbers compared to Obama's, and especially Biden's, I mean, it's shocking how little regulation he imposed on the economy during his 4 years in office compared to what Biden's done so far. Something on the order of magnitude, like Biden's approaching $2 trillion worth of costs, I think, where Trump was under 100 billion. Even though the Obama administration was only around like 400 or 500 billion, I think, by the time it was all said and done. So I think that would be well, it's not necessarily a systematic reform that gives power back to Congress. It does slow the agencies down.
Yeah. Well, thanks, Adam. Charles, maybe one more question for you on the Congress chapter. As was said at the outset of the event, of today's event, this is not focused on the courts, right? This isn't about litigation, but one of the doctrines that's come out of the courts in recent years is the major questions doctrine, where the courts have been very skeptical of agencies suddenly claiming regulatory power over the most significant economic or political questions of the time. Supposedly power that had been dormant in these old, 20 or 30 or 100-year-old statutes. The major questions doctrine is the new rule of skepticism towards those sorts of agency arguments. Of course, then the question is, well, what counts as a major question, right? What actually triggers this doctrine in courts? In our book, there's a chapter on incorporating the major questions doctrine into the White House regulatory oversight process. Why should the White House do that? What would that look like, and what's the purpose of it?
Well, yeah, thanks for that question. I think the one way to think about major questions is, it follows as the lawyers among us know, as a somewhat related, but possibly, claiming not to be related to the non-delegation doctrine that, has been dormant about the limits of what Congress can delegate. But it's very much focused. One distinction that at least is emerging as I see it is that it's focused on discovering new grants of power, not necessarily looking at the original grant of power, but understanding the grant of power narrowly, without specific clear statements by Congress that somebody has this authority. So an example, for instance, is this idea that during the COVID pandemic, that OSHA could enforce various sort of, public health rules as sort of workplace safety rules. Okay, that was sort of considered to be a violation of the major questions doctrine. And that discovery of new things, which clearly should be legislative in nature, if something like that's going to happen, its origin, that authority, that new way to govern Americans, that new authority over the American people should arise from the deliberative process that is involved in legislation and not internally in an agency. And so it's just a good duty. I get back to my point. I believe it's part of the president's duty to take care that that it's because it's not faithful execution to invent new authorities where they don't exist. And I think that as interpreted by Congress, rather by the Supreme Court, as interpreted by the Supreme Court over your authority. So the president is implementing his authority as that has been clarified by the Supreme Court in the major questions doctrine. And I think he's implementing it institutionally by having a review, first at the agency level, and then I think at OIRA of, it's looking at the various sort of rules and laws and principles of regulation and of good administration and a good administrative law. And this is part of that. This is a new principle, new clarified principle the Supreme Court has done, and it should undergo a screening whether or not that statute has exceeded statutory authority or is asserting statutory authorities that have never been asserted before within the context of the law that it is implementing.
Great. Well, thanks for
Yeah,
that.
if I can just add something real quick, Adam.
Yeah, go ahead,
One thing to what Charles just said, I think one of the things that happened, and maybe it happened earlier, but I just really noticed it under Biden and during COVID, this idea, Biden especially, his administration, just wanted to push the bounds. It's almost like they knew things were going to get struck down by the Supreme Court, but they just wanted to try it anyway and just like almost dare the Supreme Court to strike them down in a way that I don't think other presidents used to do. It used to seem like, the legal team would get together and say, this is probably not going to be legal, so let's just not even do it. But that kind of norm seems like it's been eroded. And I'm not even 100% convinced that Trump is not going to further do that in his term as well, which is one reason why I think having something like, requiring the agencies to think about the major questions doctrine before they push something up, rather than just say, hey, let's just throw it out there and make the Supreme Court strike it down. And in the meantime, we'll make everybody all nervous. I think it's just a bad norm to have in government in general.
Yeah, the major questions doctrine, it certainly had a ripple effect through the agencies already. After that first round of Biden-era Supreme Court decisions, you saw news coverage that the Securities and Exchange Commission and others were going back to the drawing board on some of their biggest rules with an eye to that. The current OIRA administrator, Ricky Revesz, President Biden's OIRA administrator, co-authored a law review article about how agencies might incorporate the major questions doctrine into their work. I think it's really, important at this time as the doctrine has really come to the forefront to think about how to institutionalize it in other parts of government. If someday there's a volume 2 of Restoring the Republic, assuming this book doesn't restore the Republic on its own, it might be interesting to think about how Congress might build the major questions doctrine more into Congress's own work. I just want to pause for a moment. I just want to point out we have about 20 minutes left in the session. If folks do have questions that they want to add to the conversation, please use the Q&A function of the Zoom platform, and I'll keep an eye on that window as we go and look for opportunities to bring questions into the conversation. Now, the third part of the third chapter of the report is titled "Protecting State Sovereignty: The Responsiveness of State Government to the Citizenry," and that's an interesting title, especially when the chapter itself, as with the other sections, focuses on executive action and on legislative action. So, Emmett, how can the federal government, and especially Congress, help to restore the state's role in being sort of responsive government, closest to the people, and better attuned to the public interest and to individual liberty?
Well, Adam, this is a very, very interesting question. I think, just as an initial comment, I think the United States federal government treats foreign governments much better than it treats state government, which is just appalling. So one of the things we suggest is having major question doctrine screening type of analysis for major grant programs being offered to the state. And that's to ensure that there is a conversation within the executive branch, and that Congress is being made aware of this conversation to make sure that grant programs do not exceed their authorities. So I'll give you one appalling example of that. Some years ago, we had the Race to the Top grant program, which under the statutory authority, the Department of Education was supposed to merely help states improve their K-12 education standards. Well, the Department of Education took that grant, and what it did is it used the grant to coerce states into all adopting the same standards. And these were content standards, which in turn dictated or necessitated that states adopt inferior standards, so that children since then have been getting an inferior education that just by 8th grade alone puts them 2 years behind their peers in high performing countries, and then it gets worse in high school. So that is an appalling overstep of congressional authorities. That's one thing that could be done. We also, drawing on legal scholarship, we suggest that the executive branch put rules on how the agencies encounter the states. So with a grant offer, right now, the agencies will oftentimes identify which official within a state or which body within a state is going to accept or reject the grant program. And they'll also oftentimes lay out a consultation process that official or body will have to go through in considering whether or not to accept the grant program. All of this is done to ensure that the states will sign on to the federal prescriptions, the federal conditions for the grant. In other words, it takes away their independent decision making, and it wrecks how the separation of powers work within the state, the decision making process in the state. States really don't have sovereignty if they can't decide who within a state is going to accept or reject a grant, and they can't follow their own consultation process. So all of that practice needs to be reined in and ended. We also suggest that any grant offered to a state should in the grant offer and in all discussions, the federal government should not just identify what the federal grant is, an amount, say $1 billion, but it should also identify always what the state contribution is in real terms. So if the state's getting $1 billion, it should also identify exactly what the state contribution is. Is it 3 billion, 4 billion, 10 billion? And that is something that is, we think owed to the citizens of the state as well as to state government.
I think these are great points. I think one of underappreciated in these debates about the state of federal government is the way in which the federal government has reshaped the state governments, and often how parts of state government have reshaped themselves to be, as I say in the foreword, basically administrative units of the federal government. It happens, as you discussed, through the funding. It also happens through a lot of regulatory programs, even programs that were for good reason or for well-intentioned reasons, sort of outsourced administration to state entities, things under, say, the Clean Water Act or the Clean Air Act. That was intended to preserve federalism in these giant federal programs. But in many ways, they caused a reshaping of the state governments themselves. Back when I was in private practice, I was always struck by the way in which, say, the water regulators in the states, they really saw themselves across state lines as part of a collective effort rather than being, part of a particular state government, right? The Iowa air regulators, to pick my home state, they oftentimes see themselves more as part of a broader community of air regulators across the states than part of, say, the Iowa government. I've always thought that's underappreciated. And I think thinking about ways in which the federal government has caused that, ways in which the federal government might help to fix that by allowing the states to really be state governments and not just administrative units. Wasn't that one of the attacks on Hamilton was that the Hamilton's goal was to reduce all the states to be just administrative units of the federal government? Maybe Hamilton did think that. I hope not. But now I'm going on too long as the moderator. I should have been shorter.
I think that's a profound point, Adam, and I think that's exactly what's happening. Really, what you have is the federal government has thrown a wrench in the way state government operates. So it's not even really so much a matter of coercion. It's an interruption or an interference with the mechanics of state government. And of course, that's ultimately an affront to the citizens and liberty. And so that is really, I think, at a crisis point.
And not just an affront to liberty, but also it makes it harder for the people to really use accountability, right? It's harder to say, and this is one of the recurring themes throughout the book. One of the goals of the constitutional structure is to make clear who's accountable for what in the federal government, whether it's Congress or whether it's an execution problem, or whether it's a state that's responsible or the federal government, right? One of the basic goals of our Constitution was to allow the people to use accountability to ensure good government. And so much of this book is an effort to re-clarify various lines of accountability. On this chapter 3, again, on protecting state sovereignty, Charles, Adam, do you have any thoughts you'd like to add on how federal reforms could make states better versions of themselves vis-a-vis the people?
Well, we do, one thing that we do mention in line with what you're talking about is we do bring up block granting and the idea of block grants. And I think, but one of the ways that those are usually introduced as ways for the federal government and federal taxpayers to save money and are seen in a fiscal context. And I think that's also true. But exactly what you say, it's also about creating a clear lines of accountability, because block granting will go directly to the state government, as opposed to the grant systems, which really emerged not that long ago, mostly in the 60s and 70s, whereby, for very deliberate reasons, to bypass state government, the federal government particularly the Johnson administration and the Great Society, started giving grants to nonprofit entities directly. Lots of direct grants of nonprofit entities, categorical grants, and to municipalities and to cities, trying to bypass the state government and the state government authority. But that also it muddles the lines of authority for the people of the state. If the block grant goes to the state, then the people of the state have one person to say and to deliberate and to shape how the federal money is used and to hold that entity, the state government, to account. And I think that's in line with the block grant suggestion and adds weight to that kind of reform.
Now we only have a little bit of time left. We got about 10 minutes, and I want to try to do justice to the last section. And just an observation before we jump in, and I'll let Emmett give an overview of it. But I think it's important to really think about the structure of this book, because even though individual liberty comes last, I think the best way to think about the themes of the book is building towards that, right? That the last chapter is on individual liberty. The chapter before that is on federalism. The chapter before that is on the federal government separation of powers, and the chapter before that is on the executive branch. And so it's sort of natural to start, you look at chapter one and say, this must be the most important thing. And in some ways, chapter one is some of the most obvious and pressing things, some of them. But I really think it's important to think of the themes of the book as building towards this last chapter, right? Each of the chapters is focused ultimately, either explicitly or implicitly, on individual liberty. The last chapter, Managing Direct Threats to Individual Liberty, is focused on liberty as such. The first proposal in the executive action section of it is the aforementioned Millsap referred to this, the show cause requirement, mandatory show cause hearings for administrative actions, enforcement actions. The last Trump administration, the first term, they had an executive order along the way proposing greater due process rights within administrative enforcement actions. I'm curious to see, I'd be surprised if we don't see that doesn't come back in the next Trump term. But Emma, could you please give us an overview of this chapter? What are these direct threats to individual liberty that we have in mind, and how can good reform go about to protect against those?
Well, maybe I'd rather defer. Oh, Emmett, you asked Emmett. Okay, good. I was I thought you said Adam.
No, look, one quick observation. We look at the law. You usually think of the criminal law and sort of private tort law, and both of those ultimately they both actually develop through the common law case by case process, and it was all kind of premised on the idea what a reasonably prudent person would do, or what are the reasonable expectations of being a citizen. These sort of administrative law, these administrative actions, I think are something different. These are things that oftentimes things that people really wouldn't think about. And so going about their normal everyday life, they do something that's reasonable and common sense, yet it transgresses a federal rule or prohibition. One of the classic examples is a fellow building a system of ditches or ponds to guard his property against wildfires. How could that possibly be wrong? So this in this area, this is things. These are things that are really driven by the agencies. And I think what we need to take a careful look at how the agencies encounter the citizens, and do the citizens have fair notice? Are the penalties fair? And do the citizens have due process? All of those things need to be looked at comprehensively. So one of the things we call for is a comprehensive review of regulatory enforcement practices. We think kind of modeled after the United States Sentencing Commission of 30 or 40 years ago, which was all geared to make sure that the system is fair and that people have fair notice of the penalties. That is something that's really important. I think that needs to be done. There's several other recommendations in there. One of is very simple. We think that any Senate confirmed official should denote that in his or her signature block. So any citizen who's dealing with a federal official has immediate notice as to that level, that person's sort of level of authority.
In just the last few minutes that we have left, about 5 minutes, Adam, Charles, would you like to point out a couple of your favorite reforms in this last section of the book? We'll start with Charles.
Okay, I'll point out one that I think people don't often think of as a sort of a direct threat to liberty, and that has to do with the agency's generation of guidance documents. Guidance documents, not regulations, and if they act as regulations, not going through the process of the Administrative Procedure Act and the protections that are built in there for the public, that is a way to sort of get around the due process and assert authority over people in a way that is beyond bounds and needs to be brought back within bounds.
Thanks, Charles. Adam?
Yeah, for me, as an economist, I'm very interested in economic growth. And so I think getting the regulation under control is just super important going forward for economic growth in this country. And so the rules around a regulatory budget, around moratorium on new regulations when the new administration comes in, sunset provisions, so regularly reevaluating regulations to see if they make sense, to see if they're working. I think all those things are really good for just making sure regulation is doing what it intends to do, and that the costs are greater and that the benefits are greater than the cost. And I think that would really help the economy grow at a time where I think growth is going to be really important given the debt and the deficits that we're looking at.
That's great. I want to throw one more thing in here on this last section. And Emmett referred to it earlier about protecting routine conduct, the ditch example he gave. One thing I'm struck by as somebody who teaches administrative law is how so much of the discussion around it in the courts and in the commentary really can identify with the perspective of the head of the agency, right? Rather than the people being regulated. And one of the greatest sort of challenges in administrative law, just the basic zeitgeist of it, is it's a lot easier for law professors to imagine being head of the EPA than being a farmer or a rancher. I'm sure there's some examples, but probably not that many of them. It's just so much easier for the people who teach and argue about these things to think about it from the vantage point of being in charge of an agency, rather than just trying to manage a small amount of land or a small business and suddenly discovering almost accidentally that you're on the wrong side of the law. And obviously, traditionally, ignorance of the law is no defense. But in an era when so much of the law is maybe written but in obscure places, or it's there's just so much of it, I think one of the great challenges for those of us who think about these issues is to really think about it from the perspective of the people being regulated, at least as much as from the ones doing the regulation. And so I was grateful to the authors of the report for including that as a standalone recommendation, but also, again, as sort of part of the zeitgeist of the broader project. But most of all, again, I'm just really, really grateful to be part of this project, grateful to be invited. It's been a lot of fun throughout the process, and including this conversation. And on that note, I think I'm going to turn it over to Jamie and to Adam for any closing thoughts.
Well, thank you, Adam. Thank you, Adam Millsap, Charles Keckler, Emmett McGroarty. This really it's been a great webinar and really great discussion. I think people can begin to see why we were so enthusiastic, not only about the care with which the book was put together and the sort of deliberation among really high quality thinkers and attorneys, et cetera, but that, in a way, one of the things I've been struck by in recent years, for a long time, I've been a judge from Massachusetts for we the people, the citizen, and the Constitution. And I've been struck by, when judging these contests, that oftentimes the young people being tested on and discussing the basic principles of the Constitution know it better than many adults in the larger society. And I think in essence, what we're trying to do is to begin to remedy that, have the general public and have lawmakers themselves and public officials understand and uphold those constitutional principles with the kind of idealism or the sense of propriety that a young person would, or a person who is looking at these with fresh eyes, or ideally the way the founders did. But again, the booklet here is it's available on Pioneer Institute's website, pioneerinstitute.org. Again, thank you guys for all of your great work. Restoring the Republic, a Blueprint for Constitutional Administration. And with that, I'm going to turn it over to Andrew Horgan.
Thank you, Jamie, and thank you all of our panelists today for really this tremendous conversation. I really learned a lot. So thank you, and understand there's a lot more to all this as well. Hello, everyone. My name is Andrew Horgan, and I serve as the Chief Development Officer here at Pioneer. We're so glad that you joined us for today's webinar, and we hope that you also found the conversation insightful and thought-provoking. As our nation enters its next chapter, the opportunities for meaningful engagement are immense. Now more than ever, it's essential for all of us to remain vigilant, informed, and active participants in civic life. With that in mind, I invite you to deepen your partnership with Pioneer. Together, we can advance the mission and deliver the fact-based research that will empower Americans with the choices and opportunities they need to live freely and thrive. So what does that partnership look like? Here are 3 simple ways for you to get involved. First, I'd ask that you share today's insights with your family, friends, and colleagues. As you saw in the chat, we'll be posting this webinar on our YouTube channel, so be sure to share that, as it's so important for us to expand the reach of these ideas to drive meaningful change. Second, I'd invite you to join us at one of our next events. One I'd like to highlight for you is our annual Reasonable Minds Can Differ program, taking place on Monday, March 3rd. This popular event features 2 constitutional law scholars who debate opposing perspectives on current U.S. Supreme Court cases. It's always an engaging, lively, and thought-provoking discussion that you won't want to miss. And if you haven't already, be sure to subscribe to our email list to get the latest updates. And finally, I'd ask you to consider supporting Pioneer's work. As an independent organization, we are fully funded by the generosity of donors like you. We don't accept government funding and really have a great partnership with those who believe in supporting our mission. If you're interested in learning more about how you can further our impact, we'd love to have that conversation and welcome you to reach out to us so that we can do that. So once again, thank you all for joining us today. Thank you to our incredible panelists, and we hope that you have a wonderful day and meaningful 2025.